Hello and welcome to Apologetics 101. I'm your host, Brian, your resident Christian apologist. And today we are doing another heat problem video on the geothermal feedback model. This one is called a terminological fence. It will be the fourth core video that I made in this series. I plan on making another one early next year with my it would be called the geothermal feedback model and evidential defense. And this is going to be a big, that would be a big evidence video. This right here will not be evidence, strongly evidence video. It's not intended for that purpose. It's intended to be able to illustrate the concepts and terms, both the physics-based ones and the ones that are specifically identified from my model, that are used to be applied to the GTF model, the geothermal feedback model, my model for resolving the so-called heat problem, which resolves the rhetorical form of the issue. Because in reality, it's not really a problem for the Genesis flood. Sometimes people get confused and they're like, well, you're trying to solve a problem that you don't think actually exists. I don't think the actual problem exists. Okay, I don't think the actual problem exists because there were mechanisms in play that kept the crust relatively cool. They kept the oceans and floodwaters relatively cool. It'd probably be warm by the end of the flood, but relatively cool. Um, and uh, um, um, and I do believe that those things were in effect and the mechanisms, and it wasn't like all that heat from a year's worth of heat was deposited all in once in the crust or in the oceans or whatever. And I don't think that that's the case. I think it was much more spread out than that, and and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But I did present some evidence for the geothermal feedback model in my very first video on this, on the depth of the heat problem, of course. And I've been presenting evidence constantly, so there is strong evidence in favor of this model. This would not be a big evidence-heavy video. It's mainly just focused on discussing the terms and concepts used within the GTF model, both the ones that come from physics and the one that specifically is identified or created just so that to better describe the model. And more on that in a little bit. Um, but essentially, that's what this video is about. It will have some sources though. It will be source heavy, probably not as much as my big evidence video at the beginning of the year, but it is going to have sources and stuff in it that we'll talk about as well. Uh, well, anyway, I got a presentation for you, and we're going to be starting that. And let's go ahead and jump on in that. All right, we're here. The first slide here, you see the depth of the heat problem is already the most challenging objection to the global flood. That was part of my original thumbnail. It's actually, I actually made like several for a book that I'm working on the depth of the heat problem. And that was also the very first heat problem video I did, the first of my core videos on the heat problem. And uh, actually the first ever heat problem video I've ever done. And this video is called the Geothermal Feedback Model, a Terminological Defense. Like I said before, it's going to be mostly based on defending certain terms and concepts that are used within the GTF model. Um, and with that said, I wanted to point out the fact that there are two different kinds of terms and categories of terms that are used in the GTF model. One is physics specific terms, and the other is model specific terms. Okay, physics specific terms, these are terms coming directly from well established modern physics. These are common terms and concepts that are used and applied to the GTF model. My model's biggest thing was to stay in agreement with modern and well established physics on its concepts and use of terms. These terms are not misapplied since this is the very way it is voiced in the literature. In other words, these terms are being used the way it is actually used in modern physics. I am not in any way misapplying these terms of physics to make it fit my model or anything like that. Model specific terms. These are made up terms that directly apply to my model, the GTF model. In order to better describe what the model is saying, these terms do not contradict known physics. They just describe the physics in a way that makes this model uh, have more clarity in what it is that it is doing. It is just a way for me to describe how I'm approaching the situation, how my GTF model is applied to the particular situation, etc. It's not in any way inventing some kind of arbitrary terms that somehow tries to bend physics to my will. That's not what it's doing. It's just specific terms that specifically applies to this particular model, and it's a better way for me to describe with clarity of what exactly it is that the GTF model, how GTF model is approaching the subject matter of the heat problem or so-called heat problem. All right. Physics specific terms, convection. Convection movement in a gas or a liquid in which the warmer parts move up and the cooler parts move down. Mantle convection is defined as the vertical transfer of heat and material within the Earth's mantle, driven by temperature differences that create buoyancy forces, resulting in upwellings and downwellings associated with plate tectonics. Okay, physics-specific terms, convection. Increasing mantle temperature generally decreases mantle viscosity. This is a quote. This in turn increases the typical mantle flow speeds and thus the characteristic strain rate of mantle flow as a result of higher thermal buoyancy forces and a lower viscosity resistance to flow. You can see the where I've got the sources here at the bottom. Okay. Inside the Earth, a temperature gradient is this is temperature gradients, is the rate at which temperature changes with depth expressed as delta T over delta Z. It quantifies how rapidly the mantle or crust becomes hotter as you go deeper, and it is the vertical temperature contrast that drives thermal buoyancy and mantle convection. A steeper temperature gradient means the difference between hot rising material and cold sinking material is larger. This increased thermal buoyancy forces, strengthening both upwelling and downwelling currents. With a bigger temperature contrast driving the system, convection becomes faster and more energetic because hotter regions rise more forcibly and colder regions sink more vigorously. All right, here's another quote. It's actually the same citation. Um, Convection in the Earth mantle can occur at Rayleigh numbers in the range of 106 to 109, depending on the heating mode of the system and whether convection is layered or includes the whole mantle. He cites the source. The higher at the Rayleigh number, the more vigorous the convection, i.e., advection of material occurs at higher speeds. The vigor of both whole and layered mantle convection is alia controlled by the mantle density, the temperature gradient across the effective viscosity of the mantle. The Rayleigh number is the ratio of the thermal diffusion and advection timescale. It gives an equation there. Rayleigh equals P times G times A times delta T times D to the third power over kappa times eta, where P is density, G is gravity, gravitational acceleration, A is coefficient of thermal expansion, delta T is the temperature difference between the top and the bottom, and the D is the thickness of the conveying layer, is the thermal diffusivity and diffusivity or diffusivity, and eta F, eta F is the effective viscosity. The Nusselt number can be expressed in terms of the Rayleigh number as Nusselt equals 0.53 times Rayleigh over Rayleigh critical. That's what RIC stands for. It says we're Rayleigh critical, um, which is raised one third. Uh, in other words, to the third power, one third power. Where Rayleigh critical is the critical Rayleigh number at which convection starts, typically of the order of 103, and beta is the power law exponent. Okay, the point of this quotation is to show you that it is actually in the literature that this is actually happening. That and the increase of the Rayleigh number increases faster convection, which triggers also faster advection and that sort of thing. All right. The Rayleigh number is a dimensionless quantity. Okay, this is the Rayleigh number, dimensionless quantity that measures the strength of thermal buoyancy relative to viscous, uh, vis, viscous and diffusive resistance in a fluid. It is defined as Rayleigh equals PGA delta T d to the third power over kappa eta, where delta T is the temperature difference across the convecting layer, D is the layer thickness, alpha is or A is the thermal expansivity, and eta is viscosity, kappa is thermal diffusivity, G is gravity, and P is density. When Rayleigh exceeds a critical value, Rayleigh critical, convection initiates and becomes faster as Rayleigh increases. Okay, the Nusselt number is a dimensionless quantity that measures the efficiency of convective heat transport relative to conductive heat transport in a fluid. It is defined as Nusselt equals total heat flux over conductive heat flux. Nusselt equals 1, corresponding to pure conduction, while Nusselt greater than 1 uh, greater than 1 it indicates that convection is transporting additional heat. Higher Nusselt values reflect more vigorous convection and greater convective heat transfer efficiency. Okay, here's the contrast between the Rayleigh number and the Nusselt number. The Rayleigh number quantifies the driving conditions for convection by comparing thermal buoyancy forces to viscosity and diffusive resistance, determining whether convection will occur and how strongly it is forced. Nusselt number, by contrast, quantifies the outcome of that convection by measuring how much heat is actually transported relative to pure conduction. In essence, Rayleigh measures the strength of the convecting driving forces, while Nusselt measures the efficiency of the resulting convective heat transport. Advective is the transport of heat. This is advection. Advection is the transport of heat or material by the bulk motion of a fluid. In geophysics, advection refers to the movement of thermal energy, chemicals, or mass through mantle or crust as the solid or partially molten material itself flows. Unlike conduction, which transfers heat through molecular diffusion, advection carries heat by physically moving hotter or colder material from one location to another. In the GTF model, advection serves as the primary mechanism for rapidly relocating heat away from the crust and uppermost mantle by physically transporting hot material downward into zones of greatly accelerated convection. As mantle temperatures rise during the flood year, viscosity decreases, buoyancy contrasts sharply, allowing the mantle's bulk motion to intensify. This acceleration circulation advects heat from shallower levels into deeper, faster moving convective cells where it can be efficiently expelled through volcanic upwellings, rapid phase change cooling, and enhanced latent heat removal at the surface. In this framework, advection does not replace conduction or convection, but amplifies the system's ability to redistribute heat quickly by moving the heated material itself. Now, sometimes people misunderstand what advection is, but advection basically is the movement of heated material itself. It's the crustal rock itself that's heated that is actually advecting, that's actually physically moving it, transporting the heat physically to the upper mantle, so it's not a direct flow of the heat itself. So advection does not have to follow things like temperature gradients and stuff like that. Here's a quote. Using this relationship, it is possible to scale the thermal conductivity to the Nusselt number of the Earth's mantle and to maintain a constant heat flow through the base of the lithosphere via conduction. If you don't know what the lithosphere is, essentially it is the crust and the upper mantle. That's what qualifies as the lithosphere. Via conduction when convection is absent. Assuming Rayleigh equals 2 times 10 to 6 power and beta equals 1/3 for the Earth's upper mantle convection, equation B2 predicts Nusselt equals 13. This implies that the heat flow provided by advection is 13 times higher than the heat flow provided by conduction. Using the effective conductive approach, the heat flow provided by advection is mimicked using an enhanced conductive heat flow in the upper mantle. Mantle convection is an advective dominated process in two respects. First, for models featuring distinct compositional components, compositional diffusion is extremely small and is often assumed to be zero. Second, the effect of thermal diffusion is small relative to that of advection, except at thermal boundary layers, particularly for high Rayleigh number convection. Now here's conduction. Hopefully the text didn't blind you guys. Conduction. This is the mechanism that describes transfer of heat within a substance through direct contact. This process occurs due to the movement of atomic particles within a material. Heat conduction is primarily an energy transfer mechanism where thermal energy moves from more energetic particles to less energetic neighboring particles. It is the most significant means of heat transfer within a solid or between solid objects that are in thermal contact. Conduction involves the transfer of heat through stationary matter by physical contact. This happens as adjacent atoms vibrate against one another or as electrons move from one atom to another. It maintains or mainly occurs in solids because of how molecules vibrate and transfer energy to nearby particles. Conduction can take place in all states of matter, but it is most effective in solids because their closely fixed structure increases the frequency of atomic interactions. The GTF model bypasses conduction by using three mechanisms: convection, advection, and volcanism. As convection speeds up in the upper mantle due to accelerated nuclear decay, that's what AN stands for here, accelerated nuclear decay, this causes advection in the crust to speed up and pull, quote unquote, pull the heat out of the crust as it is being carried by the flow of physical material due to how fast mantle convection would be going. This would cause advection to remove the heat at super fast speeds. The heat is then expelled via volcanic eruptions all around the world, removing it from the interior of the Earth. This doesn't mean conduction stops or is rendered irrelevant during the flood. Only the excess heat generating in the crust and mantle does not need to go through conduction. All right, here's some more quotes. This one's for feedback loop. We're going to be talking about feedback loop. I did some of these definitions also in my original video on the depth of the heat problem. An effect where an amount or level produced by a process system, etc., increases or decreases the amount of produced by the same process system, etc., at a later time. That's from Cambridge Dictionary. In a scientific context, a feedback loop is a process where a system's output is used as input to modify its future behavior, either to maintain stability, negative feedback, or to amplify changes, positive feedback. The path by which some of the output of a circuit system or device is returned to the input. That's kind of like the more artificial form of the feedback loops. You can use that in technology and that sort of thing. A feedback loop is the part of the system in which some portion or all of the system's output is used as input for future operations. Okay, here's my definition. It's a system where the results. No, I'm just making sure you wasn't trying to pull something like put something on the top or something. Don't do that, please. Okay, here's my definition. It's a system where the results are being fed back into the system to make further changes to the system as time moves forward. Okay, positive feedback loop is essentially the most foundational concept, one of the most foundational concepts in my entire model, along with the fact that this is driven by the heat. Both of these two facts make up the foundation of this model, and my model would absolutely flatline if these two weren't true. But ironically, it is also the most ignored concepts in this entire model. So that's interesting to note. Let's talk about positive and negative feedback loops. A positive feedback loop is a process by in which a change in a system triggers a response that amplifies or reinforces that initial change, pushing the system further away from its original state. A negative feedback loop is a process in which a change in a system triggers a response that counteracts or reduces that initial change, helping the system maintain stability or homeostasis. Examples of positive feedback loops would be like childbirth that releases a chemical that causes the retractions. The more retractions the woman has, the more her retractions increases. As fruits ripen, they release ethylene, which causes further ripening, which leads to further releases of ethylene, um, which causes an even greater increase in ripening, and so on and so forth. There are many examples of positive feedback loops. Another example would be a fever. As fever is hotter, our body sweat, but our sweating acts as a natural cooling mechanism for our bodies, which helps reduce our fever. The higher our fever gets, the more we sweat. Examples of negative feedback loops is like the water cycle, which is a very famous example of a negative feedback loop. Actually, it's a famous example of feedback loop. Most people have remember the water cycle, at least if you're in the States, in the United States, you remember the water cycle from school and grade school. The water cycle, this is a perfect example of a well known feedback loop, and it's a negative feedback loop. As water heats up, it evaporates. In turn, this evaporated water vapor condenses into clouds as it replenishes the lost water from the earth and returning the water it took in the form of rainfall. Digestion of our food is another example. As we digest food, this causes an increase in nutrients and glucose levels in our bloodstream. And so there's lots of examples of feedback loops. In fact, biology has a ton of examples of feedback loops that exist in our body, both positive and negative. All right, relevance to the GTF model. This is one of the two most fundamental and key components of this model in which makes this model works. And in fact, it's also the most ignored out of all these concepts. The evidence shows these kinds of positive feedback loops, which includes cooling mechanisms, often associated with volcanic activity and geological events. Is then in turn scaled to the extent and magnitude of the global flood. This is a system that is feeding back into itself as cooling mechanisms cool the planet. It is also driven by the very heat that's generating, making it thermally driven. This component of my model is so fundamental that if it was not true, the model would not work. It would actually absolutely flatline. Ironically, it is also one of the two components that are also most ignored by the critics. If the critics mention it at all, which they hardly ever do, but if they do mention it at all in the response, they usually try to brush it off or arbitrarily dismiss it as quote unquote irrelevant, despite the importance of to it my model. If they deal with it at all, because they usually don't deal with it at all, but the vast majority of the time they just ignore it entirely, as per by the time this video is made. Stephen Boatman's law. Stephen Boatman's law describes the relationship between a body's temperature and the amount of thermal radiation it emits. It states that the total radiant heat power emitted from the surface is proportionally to the fourth power of its absolute temperature. This law is also known as Stephen's law. The Stephen Boatman's law posits that the total energy radiated per unit surface area per unit time, also reference it um, to as radiant ex, uh, excitance. Excitance. is directly proportional to the fourth power of the black body's absolute temperature, or T. For an ideal absorber or black body, the relationship is expressed as U over A equals sigma T to the fourth power. The sigma is the Stefan-Boltzmann's constant. The SI unit for radiant exist, existence, existence, I don't know that accidents. M is watts per square meter. W times M raised -2. The SI unit for absolute temperature. T is Kelvin, or K. All right, the Stefan-Boltzmann's constant, the constant of proportionality, which is identified by the variable sigma. Uh, si, uh, si, uh, I'm forgetting my Greek here. Sigma, sigma is known as the Stefan-Boltzmann constant. Its value has been determined through radiometric measurements, with one such calculation in 1985 yielding 5.66967 plus or minus 0.00076 times 10 to the -8 power, Wm to the -2 power, and K to the -4 power. This constant is derived from other fundamental physical constants, including the Boltzmann constant K, the Planck constant H, and the speed of light in a vacuum C. All right. Um, Now, another term that's used a lot in my model is heat sinks. A heat sink refers to a natural element or a system that absorbs, retains, and distributes heat from the environment or other sources, helping to regulate temperature. Water is one of the most significant natural heat sinks. Heat sinks, like water, are critical for regulating temperatures in various environments, contributing significantly to climate stability and ecological balance. Their ability to absorb, store, and release heat plays a vital role in both natural ecosystem and human-made systems. The mantle of the Earth can also be considered a natural heat sink, playing a crucial role in regulating temperatures and thermodynamics within the Earth. The mantle consists primarily of silicate rocks that are rich in magnesium and iron. It extends from the base of the crust about 30 kilometers deep down to the outer core about 2,900 kilometers deep. Space is also a heat sink, since the only true escape of heat from the Earth is to be radiated out into space. Now, I had a critic on my channel. They actually did get kind of started conflating two different categories here. In engineering, they define a heat sink in such a way um, that the way in which they define it, because something has to have specific heat capacity, absorb heat, that sort of thing. And he starts saying, well, that can't be the space. He also kept trying to say the atmosphere was heat sink, but under that definition, atmosphere wouldn't be either. But he kept trying to say that space was not a heat sink. But in planetary science, it's actually considered a heat sink. It's actually an infinite heat sink because the heat goes out and doesn't come back. He tries to target that too, like, well, maybe it could be absorbed by something else out there in the space, black holes, whatever. But that's irrelevant, because the point is that the heat's not coming back. The only true escape for heat in the Earth system is space. Graham knows this, but some reason Graham likes to be contentious. Even things that we would agree with, he would try to fight me over. Uh, but but essentially, he was conflating categories, and he was looking at heat sinks through the eyes of the way engineering often considers heat sinks, and not realizing that I was using the term in a more general sense that included the way in which it's used no matter what. I mean, it's used like that in planetary science, right? As a heat sink. But he was using it on the engineering side. So, but any given case, space is considered a kind of more of an infinite heat sink, because the heat can be dumped into space, and it is irreversible. It's not going to fly back into the atmosphere or something. In my model, I use three different heat sinks: water, space, and here's something new, a new revision to my GTF model, the mantle. That's right, a new revision to my heat sink, and it's really a small revision. It's not a major revision because not just because it's 100% consistent with everything I say in the model, but also because I already have the heat advecting into the mantle. I've always had that. But what I originally assumed was that all that extra heat, the heat that's coming into the mantle from the crust, all the heat that's generated in the mantle, would just simply come up through volcanic eruption. So that's the way I had calculated everything. That's the way I figured everything. And then I realized that I found out that the mantle is actually a very, I already knew it was a heat sink, but I didn't know how powerful a heat sink. It's actually a very powerful heat sink. It's got an incredibly high heat capacity and to absorb heat. And you could absorb all that heat from the thermonuclear decay, and it would not even it would might raise it a few degrees. But given how hot the mantle is today, it is actually considered to be a extremely powerful heat sink, and most of that heat that was generating in the mantle and the crust would actually be absorbed by the mantle. Now, that doesn't mean the mantle would hold on to it indefinitely. Some of the heat would come up, and maybe some other heat along the lines as time goes on. And that's something I'm going to be looking more into eventually. But some of that heat will come up through volcanic eruptions, and then that's, all part of my model and stuff. So, so I added the mantle as a heat sink. This also would mean now, even though this is a very small revision, it's small because, like I said, it's 100% consistent with everything that was said in my model, and it's also already got heat advecting into the mantle. I just didn't realize that the mantle would actually not expel all of the heat that's generating there. Most of it would probably likely, in the most probable sense, we're talking about logic, probability. Most of it is going to be absorbed by the mantle. This is something that I factored into my numbers recently, and that sort of thing too, as well. But any given case, the mantle is a very powerful heat sink, and this is also. But even though this is a small revision, it has major implications to a lot of different degrees, even some that extends beyond my model. But I'll get into that in eventually later on down the road. But but it does have another implication because see my model does something with the heat. It spreads it out, okay, in different ways, whether it's stored in water, whether it's being expelled by volcanic eruptions, whether it's some in the atmosphere, whether some in the clouds, of the troposphere, whether it is being radiated into space. My model just kind of spreads that heat out. And this is good because we don't want to put all the heat in one spot. That's what gets the critics into trouble because they tend to assume that all that heat is just concentrating in one location, when in reality it's actually spread out. And that's the way we see heat today, and the way thermodynamics is. We don't observe heat just crumbling down in one spot, ready to melt the earth. That sort of thing. It's always spread out. And that's what my model does. It spreads the heat out the way it's supposed to, but the mantle spreads it out even more because most of the heat is being absorbed by the mantle as a powerful heat sink. So this is a cool revision to my model, and I love it. But it's 100% consistent with everything my model is already saying. It just calculates it on the basis of that known fact concerning the mantle. Now, here's a quote on the mantle as a heat sink. Studies show that the whole mantle convection removes 3 times more primordial heat from the Earth's interior and 6 times more from the core than does two-layer convection in 4.5 billion years. That's the secular timescale. Mantle volumetric heat generation rates for both models are comparable to that of potassium depleted chalkite, and thus surface heat flux balance does not require potassium in the core. Hole and two-layer mantle convection differences are primarily due to lower mantle thermal insulation and the lower heat removal of efficiency of the upper mantle as compared with that of the whole mantle. In other words, the mantle is a very powerful heat sink. I just wanted to make sure I quote sources on that. Okay, here's some more. The mantle must accommodate the heat input from the core via vigorous convection and redistrib- redistribution of the heat, ultimately cooling to space. In geophysical literature, Earth's mantle is treated as a massive thermal reservoir. As Francis Nemo explains, the mantle has a large heat capacity and thus acts as a substantial thermal reservoir, meaning it responds slowly to changes in heat flux due to enormous mass and heat capacity. In discussing the Venusian mantle, this is the mantle of Venus. Roth et al. Emphasized that Venus is a silicate planet broadly comparable to Earth, and note that the large heat capacity and high viscosity of that silicate mantle causes huge thermal inertia and long dynamic timescales. In other words, it absorbs heat for long periods of time, and it's very comparable to that of Earth in terms of its mantle. Here's model specific terms. We're going to start with the first one. Remember, these are terms that are specific for the GTF model. Symmetrical versus asymmetrical. Asymmetrical, this is a linear approach that most heat problem solutions take, which assumes a physical top off limit which is reachable. Such mechanisms and systems do not feed into itself. Think of it like walking on and along a straight line. Eventually, you'll reach an end. Many heat problem solutions were like this. This is why eventually they always reach a physical point. They can go no further. The GTF model system here is symmetrical, so it has never reached the physical limit. This was the problem with many heat problem solutions and why many of them failed in the past and why many had opted for a more divine solution in the past. Just kind of a way of understanding that asymmetrical is a linear approach. Okay, just like I said at the beginning, it's a linear approach. Symmetrical, this is a non-linear approach since the system and mechanisms feed back into itself in the form of a thermally driven positive feedback loop. It never reaches these physical limits. Yes, it has those limits. I can see the straw man rolling. Some people thinking now I'm denying these physical limits when I'm not. Yes, it has those limits, but it never reaches them. Think of it like someone walking along a circle. They never reach the end of the circle. In a feedback loop called a negative feedback loop, note those terms from our earlier discussion, the Earth's water supply is limited. This means the amount of water that can be, this is an example, by the way, this amount means that the amount of water can be evaporated on Earth is limited by how much water that's here. Could you evaporate the entire Earth's water supply? In theory, yes. But then why can't we? The reason is because the evaporated water becomes water vapor, which condenses into clouds, and after so much concentration of water moisture, it returns the water back to Earth. So even though the Earth's water supply is mathematically limited, the water is returned to Earth, causing a balance to be maintained. The GTF model is a symmetrical approach, thus, these physical limitations are never reached. Again, this is about reaching those physical limitations, not about them existing or not existing. Okay, misapplications of the model. Many in the past has decided to try and treat my model like it's an asymmetrical approach to the heat problem when it is not. They may, for example, point out that clouds can only cool off the Earth with a max number of heat received by the sun. Talking about the albedo effect. This is true, but irrelevant to my model. The amount of cooling would not only never exceed this number, but it never reaches it. Since the clouds are reduced to rain, as more clouds form and are able to reflect more sunlight throughout the course of the flood year. This is on a system that feeds back into itself, so it cannot be treated as an asymmetrical approach. Some of the strawman that I cast to my model actually assumes a asymmetrical approach and ignore the symmetrical approach. I told you that they ignore the positive feedback aspect of this model like the plague. So yeah, so they end up misrepresenting my model a lot. All attempts to treat it as such not only fails, but is strawmanning the model. More recently, Dr. Dan Stern Cardinal had thought the heat in the floodwaters would be touching, quote unquote, touching the crust, but this is also false because that same heat had caused the water to rapidly evaporate, moving that heat at incredible speeds, causing increases in cloud covering and increased rainfall. The heat was never touching the crust at all since it was rapidly being removed. The water touched the crust, but not the heat. A feedback loop system changes the dynamics of limits. The system is feeding into itself. Such limits are not reached. Another straw man argument is that happens is when one assumes I am suggesting the limits do not exist, but that's not what I am saying here. They exist, but they're just not reachable within the feedback system itself, since it's symmetrical approach, not an asymmetrical approach. Some have further assumed that I am saying that such limits are irrelevant, which is also not what I am saying here. It is just not reachable within the system itself. This creates a very unique approach among heat problem solutions that cannot be simply ignored, although people do quite often. Mechanically dependent versus math dependent. All right, math dependent. This is a type of model that is dependent upon the numbers, values, and math concerning the accuracy of the model involved. If the math didn't work, then the model wouldn't work. For example, relativity is very math dependent. It's dependent on the numbers working out to make the theory work. When Einstein realized that the equations in his theory would result in a universe that wasn't eternal, a belief that Einstein and most scientists held at the time, he tried to quote unquote fudge the numbers together by dividing by zero, which is a serious mathematical no-no. Upon Edwin Hubble's discovery, however, he removed the quote unquote fudge factor from his equations, calling it the greatest blunder of his career. The GTF model is not math dependent. It uses math, but only as a way to illustrate the validity of the mechanics of my model, but not to make my model work. The validity of the model is associated with the mechanics, not the values. The values add up because of the mechanics of the model itself. Mechanically dependent. The GTF model is, however, mechanically dependent. This means it is what drives the model, so its validity is tied to its mechanics. The Big Bang model, which by the way, I do not agree with the Big Bang model. I think it's loaded with problems, lots and lots of problems actually. We can get into that another day, but the point is, it is a model that is believed and that sort of thing, and I'm using as an example here. The Big Bang model is a mechanically driven model. Its validity or lack of validity is tied to its mechanics. Whether it works or don't work, it's all going to be based on the mechanics of the model itself. That doesn't mean it doesn't use math, but when math is applied, like say before the Big Bang, uh, it never, quote unquote, before the Big Bang, it never works because relativity and quantum mechanics don't mix. So we have no known physics that would work inside a singularity. The GTF model is a thermally driven positive feedback loop The more heat that's added, the more everything increases proportionate to the amount of heat introduced into the system. If you take away the heat, the loop would weaken, but it would tighten or lighten the thermal load on the cooling mechanisms and components within the system, thus causing a balancing effect to occur. If a mistake is made in the math, as soon as it is corrected, everything snaps back and the system still works, with most of the heat effectively removed by the end of the flood year and the rest safely mitigated over time following the flood. Changing the values affect the math and the numbers, but not the mechanics of the system, nor the validity of the mechanics itself. The math affects the numbers and values, but not the system, nor the mechanics of the system, nor its validity. The validity of this system is directly tied to the mechanics of the system. At the end of the day, the numbers work because the mechanics of the system does. Okay. Now, some people like to straw man me on this, assume that somehow that I think that that the math doesn't matter, or it's irrelevant, things like that. None of those things are actually what I'm saying. I'm not even saying that my model doesn't use math; it actually does. The issue is whether or not if the validity of the model is based on the numbers, or whether the math is based on the validity of the model. The math works out because the model does. That's why. And that's what essentially I am talking about here. I'm not saying it doesn't use math. I'm not saying math isn't important. I'm not saying it's irrelevant. I'm not saying any of those things. All those things are straw man arguments to my what I'm saying here. Some people have opted to assume that I am, or my model is, making math or the numbers irrelevant, insignificant, or unimportant, or not used at all in my model. All these are strawman arguments, and they don't represent at all what I am saying here. The math, at the end of the day, is not what holds my model to the fire, so to speak, but it's the mechanics. The math works because the mechanics of my model works. The math is used within my model, but it's secondary and as a way to illustrate the validity of the mechanics of the system. In fact, I've actually said that one of the main reasons that the math is important is because it demonstrates that my model works. I've actually had people say, well, you have to be able to show math or you wouldn't know if your model works. That's what I said. That's exactly what I said. I said one of the main reasons that the math is so important to my model is because it illustrates the fact that it works. So that's exactly what I'm saying here. Um, the math is used within my model, but it's secondary and as a way to illustrate the validity of the mechanics of the system, but it's not what makes the system work. The system is driven by the very heat that's generating. The math, however, is important. Without it, you wouldn't have come to the conclusion in the first place that my model works. So it is important. However, it is secondary to the model itself, since the mechanics of this system is primary. People think because I say my system isn't math dependent, I am downgrading it in some way or downgrading the value of math, but that's not the case. The math has a role in my model, but it is just isn't what makes my model work. The mechanics is. Thus, the math follows the validity of my system's mechanics, but the system mechanics doesn't work because the math does. Um, Effective removal. Okay, let's talk about effective removal versus final removal. This is something I had to make a distinction of when I'm talking about this because a lot of critics was pounding on the whole radiation out into space. And so I had two critics that was challenging me. One YC who had a different model, a competing model for me, and all three of them wanted to challenge this. And this is what they tend to focus on the most. And so I had to make a distinction to show that what I am calling effective removal and final removal in order to understand what I'm actually saying. Because in my model, the real issue in the heat problem is really not so much as uh, the heat itself. It's the fact that you got so much heat in your and it's being consumed either in one location or it's not removing fast enough from those locations. Whatever heat's in the crust or whatever is heat in the floodwaters, whatever heat is in the mantle. and the atmosphere and these things, and they're not. No, it's not moving fast enough. Okay, essentially, what my model does is it shows that this heat was removed effectively fast enough during the global flood. And so I distinguish the difference between effective removal and final removal. And what I actually mean by that. Effective removal, this is where the heat is removed from the quote unquote problem areas, the crust, the floodwater slash oceans, atmosphere, etc., and spread out in other ways, but is removed from these areas before any catastrophic results happen. The melting of the crust, the boiling of the Earth's oceans, the burning of the Earth's atmosphere. About 99% of the heat is effectively removed from these problem areas by the end of the flood year. The real issue is not the heat itself, but the removal of the heat from these quote unquote problem areas fast enough. Donnie Beninsky from Standing for Truth wasn't the first to say that. I was. I was the first to actually express that in the Depth of the Heat problem video. In fact, I think he got it from me. He was the first to add a term to it, throughput, but I was the first to say it. My model does this, and I call this effective removing the heat. Effectively removing the heat. Final removal. This is when all the heat is removed from the planet Earth's out into space. This is the only true escape for heat in the Earth system. Is the final removal. Due to the law in physics called Stephen Boltzmann's law, we discussed that earlier, this heat leaving the Earth can be calculated since the Earth is not a closed system. Although a lot of critics treat it like it's a closed system, it's not a closed system. Heat can escape it in the form of infrared radiation. However, my model has certain nuances, such as the heat does not radiate from the surface, but from cloud tops, troposphere, stratosphere. It is pushed in effective radiation zones and it radiates above the bottleneck. The bottleneck is going to be anywhere from like the upper troposphere, which even in the upper troposphere there's some bottleneck, but it's not as bad as the lower troposphere. And then, of course, the stratosphere, which is definitely above the bottleneck. And this is not out in space. I had a critic that thought I was somehow shooting this out into space when I said above the bottleneck, but that's not what I meant. Um, Above the bottleneck in atmospheric physics, there is a bottleneck around the troposphere, uh, especially the lower troposphere, in which you got a buildup of greenhouse gases, and greenhouse gases tend to absorb infrared radiation, and so infrared radiation will still escape into space from there, but it's much slower. It's faster when you actually put the heat above this bottleneck. It is pushed in effective radiation zones and it is radiates above the bottleneck. However, even then, it takes time. My model breaks the heat generating during the flood, post flood, into three phases: the heating phase, the cooling phase, and the removal phase. This third and last phase occurs in the post flood period. My new numbers suggest it lasts for 1,000 years past the end of the flood. It never has all of the heat within the flood year all in the atmosphere at one given time. Some of the heat is in the atmosphere while most of it is absorbed by the mantle, and some of it is still in the water, causing the water to rapidly evaporate, although nowhere near as fast as it did in the peak of the flood. Talking about this is post-flood period, which causes heavy snow buildup in the upcoming ice age post-flood. Some of the heat absorbed in the mantle could continue ongoing volcanism, although at a much weaker scale. But even weaker is relative here. So it could. I was sort of wondering what the implications of my model would be in the post-flood ice age model. Mike Ward like predicts like volcanoes with these powerful eruptions erupting during the ice age, sustaining the ice age for a period of about 700 years. And since my take about a millennium to get the heat out, and of course you got volcanism still continue going on during this time. This all this heat that's absorbed in the mantle would make a lots of sense as far as sustaining the ice age following the flood. All right. Okay, refuting some common straw man here. on that, calculating Stephan-Boltzmann's equation by assuming surface radiation. Normally, you'd calculate Stephan-Boltzmann's equation from the surface, but my model doesn't radiate heat from the surface. It radiates from cloud tops, troposphere, and stratosphere of Earth, which is above that bottleneck that I mentioned earlier. Assuming a bottleneck in atmospheric physics, there is a bottleneck in the lower troposphere. I mentioned that due to the greenhouse gases there, they absorb infrared radiation. However, my model places the heat above the bottleneck, so it's much faster in releasing the heat to space than it would have been otherwise. All of the heat during the flood or by the end of the flood year is deposited in the atmosphere. This is false. Yes, space is its end game, and yes, this is the only true removal of the Earth in that absolute sense. But this doesn't mean it is placed there in the atmosphere and that it's all there at one given time, building up. At one given time, the heat is spread out, regulated, and mitigated over time. Um, some of which is still happening even beyond the flood year. Critics seem to want to place all the heat at one given place at one given time, but that's not how heat and the laws of thermodynamics operate. Heat is more spread out than that. Some of the heat is even still in the water by the end of the flood year, stored. With my model's revision of the mantle as a heat sink, it's even more spread out since a significant portion of it is even in the mantle being distributed over time. All of the heat needs to be gone from the atmosphere by the end of the flood year. False. The heat is released from the atmosphere to space over time, even going past the flood year, and the more heat is added as time moves forward. The atmosphere never builds the heat up uncontrollably, nor burns the atmosphere up as a result of too much heat at one given time. It is safely mitigated over time. There's one critic that just kind of just focuses. He focuses on the phase three of my model, on the final removal of the heat a lot because he thinks that that's the fundamental aspect of my model. It isn't, but he thinks it is, and so he targets that, and he's like, well, I just don't understand how you can not get the atmosphere burned up, and he doesn't seem to understand that it's not concentrated all in the atmosphere. It is over time. It's building up. It's distributing it. It's not. It's not. It's more spread out. So the heat's not all in the atmosphere to begin with. And on top of that, this is a thermally driven positive feedback loop. so, as the heat is lessening and lessening and lessening, the evaporation eventually slows down, and so is latent heat removal. And so you still wind up with warm water, but it's not like hot, hot. But it's warm enough. It's warm enough to increase evaporation, probably following the flood, into the post flood period, and that sort of thing. So it never burns the atmosphere up at any given time. It is safely mitigated over time, and that's just the truth of it. Um, so the claim that somehow it has to be all concentrated in the atmosphere is incorrect. It continues to remove heat past the flood year. So it's not the flood year is not a boundary for this model to end. In fact, phase three is continuation of this model in the post flood period. Okay, refuting some more common objections. Too much heat at one given time. False. The heat is built up over time. Is built up over time and only has the most heat at the peak of the flood before decreasing rapidly in the heat that's generating. It never has too much heat at one given time, nor does it get so high that it burns up the atmosphere. This is an assumption the critic is bringing to the table. And heat built up over time is actually referring to the fact that people are just kind of calculating a year's worth of heat, and then they try to use that to try to say that it's building up uncontrollably, and that's just not the case. The heat can be redeposited by touching the crust. That's false. Also, that was argument made by Dr. Dan Stern-Continental. I had actually dealt with that. I made an entire video on that, dealt with that particular argument. First, the heat isn't touching the crust. The heat is being removed by latent heat removal, see below. Second, the laws of thermodynamics wouldn't permit it. Heat can only move from warmer slash hotter regions to cooler slash colder regions, never in reverse. The floodwaters would have been cooler than the crust, thus the heat won't flow in reverse. Third, by the way, this would violate the law of thermodynamics. Uh, uh, um, uh, One of the critics on my channel said, "Well, yeah, but maybe Dan didn't know that he was violating the laws of thermodynamics." I agree. He probably didn't. He probably was misunderstanding my model. He probably was misrepresenting my model, even though I did correct him on it a couple times. But just the same, he probably didn't fully understand that in the course of my model, but it doesn't change the fact that he was violating the laws of physics. He might not have meant to. I agree with that. He probably didn't mean to, but he still did it. If I live in Tennessee, the highway speed limit is 55. If I'm going 65 and someone a cop pulls me over, gives me a ticket, and I can't say, well, I thought it was 55, and I was okay. In that case, I'll just let you go. That's not how that would go. He would give me the ticket anyhow, say ignorance is no excuse for the law, and I would still get fined for it as a result. Just because he didn't know about it doesn't mean he didn't violate the laws of physics. Third, you'd still need a mechanism to get the heat back into the crust, and I had to use three mechanisms to get it out of the crust, so it's not going to be that easy to try to put it back in. The only mechanism that can do this by touching it is conduction. We talked about that earlier, but conduction is super slow. If I'm using super fast processes to get the heat out of the crust, you can't redeposit the heat via a super slow process like conduction. It would move it faster than it's being redeposited. Okay, advection can't pull heat out of miles of crust. False. It can. You can even Google this. Advecting the heat out of the into the upper mantle would violate the laws of thermodynamics. False. I've done checked up on this. People who claim that don't understand the laws of thermodynamics nor advection. The flow of heat can only move from warmer slash hotter regions to cooler slash colder regions. That's true. But advection is the flow of heat through the physical movement of material. In my model, that's due to the increased convection speeds in the upper mantle. You can Google this too. It's based on mass movement of actual the physical. It's like the physical rocks of the crust that's heated. The heated rock itself is actually what's flowing and is moving and pulling all that heat down into the upper mantle. So it's not the movement of the heat directly. So this does not have to follow temperature gradients. It does not have to go in the direction from hotter to cooler regions and that sort of thing. It doesn't need to do that because it is based on mass motion of the rock and also the heat capacity of the receiving reservoir. In this case, the mantle, which is a powerful, as we already established, is a powerful heat capacity, and that sort of thing. So it would actually affect in the mantle. All right. Um, Okay, what's more, it's found in the literature itself. Yes, I read you some of the text on that. Advection always dominates over conduction. Because of this, it's the physical crust with the heat in it that's moving toward the upper mantle. If this was conduction, then it would be required to follow the temperature gradient. However, this is not. Heat removed from the floodwaters would return in rain, mostly fall. Some would return, but most would have been released in the upper troposphere, and rapid evaporation would have removed any returning heat just as quickly. Latent heat removal. Latent heat removal within the scope of my model, I refer to the normal act of heat removing being removed from the surface of the floodwaters rapidly as a latent heat removal, since residual heat that was absorbed into it is being removed very fast. Now, of course, latent heat comes actually from physics, and this is actually, even though I describe it as latent heat removal, the latent heat is being removed from the water. This is according to conventional physics. That's why I have latent heat as a term in the physics specific category, and I just put latent heat removal because it's the term that I use to describe this in the model specific terms, categories. Evaporation always occurs as fast as the temperature would allow, meaning the hotter it is, the faster it evaporates. This also means that the latent heat is removed at the same speed it evaporates, since latent heat is always removed from the surface of the floodwaters as it evaporates. This also allows for more room for the floodwaters to absorb more heat, as the water loss of water is replenished by more rain during the global flood. Water has a high specific heat capacity of 1.86 joules per 1 degree Celsius per gram of water. This means its total heat capacity scales by volume, so the total heat capacity of the floodwaters would have been enormous to begin with. The rapid latent heat removal would have removed the heat at astonishing speeds during the flood for the first 5 months approximately. This would have been proportionate to the heat going into the floodwaters as well. Buffering the ark. The floodwaters would have acted as an amazing thermal buffer for Noah and the rest of the ark, including all the residents of the ark and the animals and Noah's family, due to the floodwaters' very high total heat capacity. Straw man argument that them glowing like a light bulb or the arc set to the flames are false. Some have asked about potassium in Noah, or the C14 in Noah and the rest of inhabitants of the ark in the wake of accelerated nuclear decay, or and. However, the trigger set into motion by the rifle theory. Now, I'm not going to talk much about the rifle theory here, but it was a theory that I proposed in my original heat problem video, the depth of the heat problem. Uh, Rifle, RIFL, it's an acronym. It stands for radioisotopic feedback loop. So it sets it on a positive feedback loop as well, but I call it the rifle theory. Um, would have only impacted radioactive elements within the Earth, and the arc residences would have been protected by roughly by a mile or so of water, because that water would have acted as a thermal buffer. This means the C14 and potassium within them would have not accelerated. They would have had, and they wouldn't have burned alive either, and they wouldn't radiate like a nuclear power plant. None of that stuff would be true. This is a non-stopper for many critics' arguments. What I mean by that, it's a non-stopper. Every single time the critics say stuff like that, I would bring this up, and this usually shuts them down. It usually just shuts them down. In most cases, right off the bat. Why? Because at the end of the day, they know it's true. They just hope you don't bring it up. But they know that water can act as a thermal buffer. They just don't want to sit there and admit that. They're not going to sit there and give you that unless you bring it up. And you bring it up, it usually stops all arguments on it. This is why I like that argument. It works. It's been stated ever since Dr. Russell Humphreys brought it up during the rape project, and it's still stated today. I've seen Dr. Jason Lau use it, and I've used it myself. It is a thermal buffer. All right. Dr. Jason Lau is a physicist, if you don't know who that is. He's been on my channel many times. All right, this is a non-stopper for many critics' arguments when you bring it up. The floodwaters as an amazing thermal buffer, it would have protected the ark from accelerated nuclear decay and the heat being generated far below them. In closing, this is my closing conclusion. The GTF model claims that the conditions of the global flood, including the heat introduced within it, would have produced a thermally driven positive feedback loop between convection, advection, and volcanism that would have created a number of effects and cooling mechanisms such as latent heat removal, increased cloud covering, and albedo effect. Volcanic cooling, which we didn't really go too much into volcanic cooling, but this is when the volcanoes shoot ash and aerosols into the stratosphere, and it blocks sunlight out and creates a powerful cooling effect. Even one volcano can impact, if it's powerful enough eruption, can impact the climate scale of Earth on a global scale and impact the temperature. And that's just one volcano. These are all over the world going off. So this would have created would have blocked sunlight in much of parts of the world, reflecting it back out into space, creating a powerful cooling effect as a result. And it is a cooling mechanism in the GTF model as well, which also a part of the the feedback loop. It is associated with the positive feedback loop, and finally release of this heat into the space. Most of this heat would have been absorbed by the mantle, and all this heat would have been spread out over time, and most of it effectively removed by the end of the flood year, and the rest safely mitigated over time with the eventual release of it into space after the flood had ended. This would not have caused the crust to melt, the water to boil or vaporize, nor the atmosphere to burn up. The heat would have had convection speeds billions of times faster than normal, which would have caused advection in the crust to move this heated material to the upper mantle at accelerated speeds, where much of it would have been absorbed by the mantle for but some of it would have expelled by a global volcanism, where some would have been deposited into the floodwaters, while some would have been deposited into the atmosphere. It follows three phases. Phase one, the heating phase, the first 5 months of it. Phase two, the cooling phase, when the cooling mechanisms are making their greatest impact, while the heat has been greatly reduced. That is over the course of the next 7 months following the end of the phase one. And phase three, the removal phase, where the last bit of heat is being effectively and finally removed as it is released into space following the global flood. The new numbers suggest about a millennium afterwards, post flood. All three of these phases overlap with each other. Okay, they all overlap with each other. All of them are equally important in terms of the phases. They really don't have anything to do with the mechanics of the model. They're really more to do with how I'm describing these events are occurring, both during the flood year and following the flood year. In terms of the GTF model, they really don't have nothing to do with the actual mechanics. I've got a critic on my channel that likes to focus on phase three, thinking that's the most foundational. It's not. The foundational element of this model is the fact that it is a thermally driven positive feedback loop. That is the most essential element of this model, and it's also the most ignored. So that shows you just how effective these arguments have been against this model. They have about as much effectiveness as you would expect, I guess. Um, Basically, they ignore the most essential element of this model and favor things that are not essential for the model itself. Um, but anyway, and of course, like I said, phase three is the removal phase where the last bit of heat is being effectively and finally removed as it releases into space. Following the global flood, the new numbers suggest about a million afterwards, post flood. All three of these phases overlap with each other. As already stated, the numbers show that this model works successfully, remove the heat. This is a very powerful model. When I input this into Liner, and I did not tell Liner it was my model. I just described it, and I asked it for a probability rating. It gave me a 9 out of 10 for both plausibility and probability, and it identified this as almost certain, quote unquote. That's what it said, almost certain that it happened this way, given those parameters, given those conditions, including all that heat that's generating. Almost certain that this happened this way. Um, the heat problem is not a the heat problem, quote unquote, is not a problem, quote unquote, for the Genesis flood, nor young Earth creationism, nor its other positions or claims. It never was a problem. So it never was a problem for the flood narrative at all. And but anyway, I hope you enjoyed this program. I was just, like I said, it's not going to be a very big evidence video. That was not its intention. It has sources in it, but it wasn't going to be a very big evidence video. I am planning for a big evidence video to happen early next year. This will be the last video before Christmas, and I have one more video, and it will be a live show before the end of the year. Granted, everything works out okay. This particular guest has canceled like 4 times, so we'll see what happens. I hope it turns out good. I really do. He assured me this time he's going to try to make it to the thing. So we'll hope for it. But if he does, it'll be the very first episode of my new Supernatural series. I can't wait. This is awesome. I've been looking forward to this. I've been and the person I'm interviewing is Dr. Michael Egner. I'm going to be doing a lot more interviews with people on near-death experiences and the existence of soul and the afterlife, heaven and hell. There's been some controversy going online about Kirk Cameron views on hell and things like that. And so it's going to be cool to actually really be digging deep into this topic matter. I love it. I enjoy it. I hope you guys are having great holidays. Merry Christmas to all y'all. Hope you enjoyed this video. And this is Apologetics 101 signing off.